The year was 1977. I was just barely out of diapers and Boss was releasing a now legendary pedal, the Boss OD-1. At this time, most guitar players were using solid-state amps, and Boss wanted to create a sound that would give the player the sound of a crank tube amp. Now, it may be hard to imagine a time where tube amplifiers weren't the norm, but I remember when I was 7 or 8 years old, I was first playing guitar, and I got my first amp, which was a Kingston solid-state amp, about half a watt. I wanted a really big, loud Marshall amp like all my Guitar Heroes played. But tube amps really weren't as universal as they are now. And inexpensive tube amps just simply did not exist. A few years later, in my early teens, I got my first real amp, a Crate G40. And a good friend of mine traded me my Ibanez chorus pedal for this Boss OD-1 in order for me to get that organic tube amp tone. Keep in mind, this is at a point in time where there really wasn't anything like the OD-1 on the market. Most of the overdrive pedals available at that time were more like fuzzes or distortions, and they were just generally more fuzzy rather than a light overdrive sound, like a smooth overdrive sound. It did have a flaw, though, and that was that it didn't have a tone control. But Ibanez saw the market demand and improved on it, adding a tone control that had to use a different style of clipping, symmetrical clipping to be exact, since Boss had a patent on asymmetrical clipping. But Boss responded to the pedal market and the tubescreamer by coming out with the SD-1 in 1981, which is incredibly similar to the tubescreamer, which was pretty similar to the OD-1. But adding this circuitry changed the sound a little bit, however. Some say for the better, some say for the worse, but you be the judge on this. Let's check out the sound differences. Many guitar players figured out that whenever you ran these type of pedals in front of a dirty amp, it not only gives you more gain, but it also tightens things up as well. And in 1985, Boss came out with the OD-2, which was kind of intended to replace the OD-1. But oddly enough, the circuitry was completely different, and as a result, they really don't sound that similar at all. But it did have a turbo section, which added a much higher gain circuit to the pedal. Fast forward to 1987, and Boss came out with the OD-3, which was intended on replacing the OD-2, with yet again completely different circuitry and completely different sound compared to both the OD-1 and OD-2. From my point of view, all three of these pedals don't have too much in common tonally with each other. All have advantages and disadvantages. But let's take a closer look at this OD-1. What we have here is an original 14-pin op-amp OD-1 and a breadboarded circuit of the same thing, except I'm just using dual op-amps instead of 14-pin op-amp, which doesn't exist anymore, really. Okay, so this may be a little confusing. Basically, ignore this here. This is the gain. This is the volume. Right now, it's off. I generally try to avoid the dark side of pedal talk, meaning I'm not a big fan of talking trash about guitar gear, but there are some real limitations to the OD-1 that we probably should address. First, there's quite a bit of mid-range to it. For some people, you may love this, and for other people, you may hate it. And of course, there's no tone control, so if you need a little bit more or less high frequencies, then you're kind of stuck. It is what it is unless you have an EQ pedal you can put after it. And some people have referred to the OD-1 as sort of a one-trick pony as well. And while that trick's pretty good, it does limit the overall versatility of that pedal. Yet another limitation is simply that there's not a whole lot of bass content to it. This lack of bass combined with the high-frequency filtering is really what gives it that mid-range content. And since it's using a non-inverting op-amp as the clipping stage, there's always going to be an element of this clean tone that's underneath it, which is just kind of a characteristic of that type of gain stage. But this could have been avoided or at least altered by using an inverting op-amp for the gain stage. Now, does this make it better or worse? I'll let you decide. Okay, so again, this may seem confusing. For this particular part, this is now the inverting circuit. That's the non-inverting circuit. This is the gain. That's the gain, of course. All the values are the same. I'm just changing the type of op-amp it is. So from non-inverting to inverting. And let's start out in non-inverting the stock way. Inverting. Not a huge difference there because fairly low output pickups in this Glazer Strat. Let me get a guitar with hotter pickups and we'll try it then. You may notice a little bit more of a difference then. Maybe. Starting out in non-inverting. Over to inverting. And finally, the power supply was just a little funky on them. Boss used a special 12-volt adapter and then limited that voltage inside of the pedal to get down to 9 volts, unless you were using the battery, of course, in which case it just uses the voltage from the battery rather than limiting that. But this basically means a lot of those old Boss pedals don't work properly with like your standard 9-volt DC power supply, like we generally use in pedals nowadays. Of course, there are mods that people can do to change this to a standard 9-volt circuit. But odds are, if you have an old vintage pedal, probably don't want someone to modify it. But what makes this pedal great? Let's talk about it. The OD-1 brought something new to the table at the time, which is asymmetrical clipping. Boss held a patent on that for a while, as I mentioned earlier. And even though that was more than 40 years ago, there are a ton of pedals on the market that use both symmetrical and asymmetrical clipping, or combinations of both. If you're a player that likes simple tone controls and not a lot of knobs and switches, then you're probably going to love this circuit and this pedal in general. They're very straightforward, just having a volume and a gain control. But my personal favorite aspect about the OD-1 is that it is a fantastic platform for those that love to modify guitar gear or build your own. There are many different things you can do to it that are quite simple, such as adding more gain, stock, adding more bass. It's the stock sound. Or even just using it as a skeleton and adding an entirely different EQ section, like a 3-band EQ. I've added an EQ, is bass, treble, and a mid control right there. It's a pretty simple EQ circuit for the most part. It is active, so we can take out bass, mids or treble, add bass, mids or treble, and I'm putting it after the drive circuit. So I do this to a lot of my circuits. If you notice the 3-band EQ stuff. I'm gonna run it off this pedal, off the actual OD-1. So it's probably safe to say if it were not for the OD-1, we wouldn't have the tube screamer. We wouldn't have the many, many variations of that type of circuit. But more importantly, we wouldn't have been able to enjoy the tones that have been captured on countless recordings from some of our favorite guitarists. So I hope you liked the video. Thanks for watching. Make sure to hit subscribe if you like it, and we'll see you next time.